On a 2x12 raftered roof system, we do get quite a few questions, people asking, how do I develop a pattern to cut these 2x12 rafters to coincide properly with the solid log gable? First step is on your pre-cut drawings, there will be a chart, and that chart is going to tell us how that gable is to be laid up. We want to work off the center line of the log wall below, and when we get done, we want to make sure that the peak of that gable, if it is a symmetrical gable, we want to make sure that the peak of that gable is lined up vertically with the center line of the log below. What that chart does for us, it tells us how much of each log course goes on each side of that center line. If it's a symmetrical gable, obviously half of each log course would be on each side of the center line. So if we work off of that center line figure and pay attention to the chart as we lay each log course up, when we get to the top, or get to the peak of the gable, it's going to be vertically above the center line of the log wall below, as it should be. If we've been diligent and we paid attention to that, we've got our log gable up. At that point, we have the basis for developing our rafter pattern. We have a small display here where we want to illustrate how we can develop that pattern. The first step in that is to realize a very important thing. What that is, if you look here closely, you'll see that the top surface of the log gable, directly on top of that we have foam gasket. Directly on top of that we have a piece of our soffit board, which is 3/4 inches thick. Sitting on top of the soffit is actually a 2x4 outlooker. This creates our gable end overhang. If we were to take the soffit board at 3/4 of an inch and add it to the 3.5 inches that this 2x4 is, we have 4.25 inches. What does that tell us? It tells us that the top of this outlooker, which is also flush with the top of this rafter, is indeed 4.25 inches above the top surface of the gable, perpendicular to the angle. A 2x12 rafter is 11.25 inches tall. We want to measure them to make sure that's what it holds out to be, but typically they're 11.25 inches. If we have 4.25 inches of that rafter above that gable, it tells us automatically that we're going to have 7 inches of that rafter below the top of the gable. If we know that and are confident with that, it's pretty easy to go to our gable end and start to develop this pattern. The first step, we would want to measure perpendicular to the angle of the gable, down the gable end, right on the inside face of the gable end, we would want to measure down there 7 inches. What that point is, it's the bottom surface of our rafter once it's installed. So what Kevin's doing here today, he's measured down 7 inches up here near the top of the gable. He's going to go down near the bottom of the gable and get a 7-inch reference point down at that area as well. In essence, what we're doing, we're drawing the bottom surface of that rafter with a physical line right on the inside of the gable end. Once we've established those 2 points, pretty simple matter, get your chalk line, pull it tight across those 2 points, and we can snap a nice line on the inside surface of the gable. Pretty straightforward. This is the bottom of our rafter. Now, if we could have constructed our gable the way we should have using the chart that I spoke of, we know that this peak is in the center of the log wall below, as it should be. Details, again, would be on your blueprints. We can take our level, we can hold it right off of the peak of this gable end, check our bubble real close, make sure that thing's nice and plumb, and at that point, we can draw a line down to the chalk line that we previously had snapped. At that point, what have we got done? We've got the bottom surface of the rafter drawn on the gable end. We've also got the center line of the ridge board drawn on the gable end. At this point, you would want to go to your blueprints and look and see what size ridge board is going to be connected to this gable end. If it's a single 2x12, for instance, a 2x12 is 1.5 inches wide. Half of that 1.5 inches would be 3/4 inch. So if we take our center line that we've drawn and we go over here 3/4 inch and draw another plumb line, mark it in 2 places. You can just, if you do it in 2 places, you can just use your framing square to draw that line. You don't have to mess with the level again. draw that line right on the gable end. You're never going to see these marks because they're going to be covered by the rafter and the ridge and so forth and so on. What we've got here now, we've got the center line of the ridge, and now we have drawn that side of the ridge physically on the gable end. Those are two excellent reference points to begin to lay out our actual pattern for that rafter. Now, Kevin, if we could bring that 2x12 over here, we can lay this out. We'll show you how easy this is to do. There's a mathematical way to do this, but the method that we're showing you here now is something that works each and every time. It should work for you with no problem whatsoever. We bring one of our 2x12 rafters over. I want to lay it down on some sawhorses. And what we want to do is we want to transfer these measurements, take these measurements and transfer them physically to this 2x12. Now we're going to call that 41 3/4 inches, okay? Obviously on a real home that's going to be quite a bit longer than that. But we want to take that dimension and transfer it over to our rafter member so we can begin to develop this pattern. Use a framing square. The little attachments that you see here, if we know what the roof pitch is, 12-12, 10-12, or what have you, we can set these at the proper place on the framing square. Automatically will dictate where our angle is. Okay, we want to transfer that measurement from the bottom of our plumb cut, okay, our line here. We want to transfer that to the bottom of our rafter. That will be the point that our bird mouth cut at the very bottom of the rafter begins. Now, to determine how long that bird mouth is going to be, the top surface of our log is a little bit over 4.5 inches. We know that a portion of this is going to be hanging down over the face of the log. There's nothing wrong with making this 5 to 5.5 inches. It's going to work out fine for you. So you might want to measure that at, say, 5.5 inches to be safe. The little bit of a gap that you might have between the vertical face of that bird mouth and the outside face of your log is not going to hurt anything. So you can see how simple that is. At this point, we have our plumb cut, which was a transferred angle from the roof pitch on the board. We have our bottom cut here of our rafter, which was developed from the line that we snapped on the gable end. We've also developed our bird mouth cut that is going to allow the rafter to sit down flat on the top of that log course. The bottom end of the rafter, we can let that run long at this point until we take these pieces, cut them, we set it up into place and see what we got going on out here at the gable or at the eave overhang. Then we can decide what we want to do out there. Before we trial fit our pattern onto our gable, what we want to do is we can do two things actually. We can either notch the tongue away, get rid of the tongue where the rafters are physically going to be sitting. That's one way to do that. Another way, we could remove the tongue totally from the top of that top log course. Either way is fine. Some people prefer the notch because it actually locates the rafters automatically in their proper position. Either way will work, but it needs to be done before we set our pattern into place. In this case, if you'll look, you'll notice that we did notch out just where the rafter is going to be. Okay? So here comes our rafter. We want to set that into place. Line our rafter up with the lines that we've already established on the gable end wall. Check out our bird mouth cut down at the bottom. It should fit just right if we did all our calculations properly. One unique thing about this type of a roof system, typically the eave overhang would use a 2x10 fascia board. The plumb cut on this eave overhang, as you can see, is quite tall. We're talking a 2x12 rafter here on a 10-12 pitch. That's a pretty tall cut from top to bottom. We would need a very, very large fascia to cover that whole plumb cut. So what we do, we can take a piece of 2x10 material, our fascia material, set it up into place like Kevin's has done here, realizing that our roof sheathing is going to come down across the top outside corner of that fascia. Set the fascia into the proper position, and we can see what we've done. We've drawn a line on the rafter here, which would represent where we're going to cut the bottom of that rafter off. Yes, it's an oddball angle. We could put a flat return for a soffit on this if we desired to do so, although we like to do the angle like you see here. You've paid good money for these logs, you might as well expose them so the world can see them. Once you've established that angle, make sure that you allow for the thickness of the soffit boards that are going to be placed on the underside of the rafter in that area, which is 3/4 of an inch. You can bring it up or down just a little bit. You want a little bit of the fascia to hang down below the soffit boards. You don't want to flush that out. So maybe come up 1/4, 3/8 of an inch, 3/4, and then draw the line where you're going to cut your rafter off. The soffit would be installed directly on the bottom of the rafter in that area. If we've done everything properly, the gable end assembly is going to work right. We've got our 3/4 inch soffit boards that in reality will be put right on top of the gable end logs with a gasket below them, and then our 2x4 outlookers will be directly above that, and everything will flush out on the top to receive our sheathing. On a final note, concerning ridge boards themselves, as we mentioned, they come in different sizes and so forth, from a single 2x12 to a double to possibly any size of a glulam beam. The ridge board itself should be notched into the gable end. As far as the vertical position of this ridge board, look on your blueprints. There'll be a detail or a dimension that shows you where it should be positioned vertically, but it should be notched into the gable end approximately 2 inches. Okay, so pay attention to your prints on that. Be sure you know what size ridge board goes in what area. Very, very important. From here, we're going to proceed over to the beam and purlin roof system and show you how that goes together.